Hey, thank you so much for clicking on the video. Before we get started, there is a major shift coming to the channel come the beginnings of May, but fret not, I will be very active and streaming regularly on Twitch. So if you have not created an account yet and followed me over on my Twitch channel, that is Dark Spider David for the username. So it's twitch.tv/DarkSpiderDavid. We're currently holding a goal of 50 followers, so if you can help out with that by checking out the channel, checking out past broadcasts that I've done, and seeing if you like what you see, hit the follow button. You won't regret it. See you then. Hey everyone, David here. So yeah, despite the news that I mentioned some time ago about what's gonna really be proceeding with videos here on this channel, that's not gonna stop me or deter me from being able to finish off my set of reviews for Spider-Man, the animated series from 1994. I already reviewed season 1 to kind of give you guys a brief insight as to what the show is all about and how it kind of resonates with me and how it's part of my childhood. Now let's dive just a little deeper into the show with season 2. Spider-Man, the animated series, season 2 proceeded to come out in September of 1995. And now, after acquiring so much money and so much acclaim after season 1, at least at the time, it does definitely present itself as a much more budgeted show with much more stride than it did in season 1. Where in season 1, yeah, it did have that cartoon, Saturday morning cartoon aesthetic where it had that whole pulpy feel of going after both the younger and the older demographic at the same time, while at the same time also catering to the people who genuinely love Spider-Man. Season 2 does that exact same thing on certain aspects, and some of those aspects I've kind of already touched on before, so I'm not going to really illustrate too much on this review because I don't really know how else to really expound on the animation and most especially that Saturday morning cartoon aesthetic that I mentioned, because not much of those two things really change in season 2. Each episode is still about 20 minutes or so in length, or even shorter at times, and they still move at a very frenetic pace where certain chops, certain edits have to be made in order to be able to fit them into that 20-minute gap, because yes, it is 1995. Yes, the budget does show a little bit to be higher in this season, especially when you take into account some beautiful animation popping in here and there. I mean, season 1 was already well animated, but season 2 kind of takes it and amps it up just a little bit, where there's some better detail and there's also some better fluidity. Obviously, they've already had designs preconceived for some of these characters, most notably Spider-Man, and then some of his rogue gallery of villains like Dr. Octopus, etc. So the conceptualization of some of these characters in their design has already been made, so all they have to do is just literally copy and paste. Only the thing that they can maybe improve upon, and they actually did in fact did, at least from my perspective, is the actual fluidity of the animations, actual characters moving from one point to the next, and of course that all needs to be taken into a heavy account with Spider-Man. When he swings, when he fights, he feels a bit more agile and a bit more animated here in season 2. Not necessarily a night and day difference, but enough for me to be able to notice. And speaking of that higher budget, yes, there's actually more CG shots in season 2 than there was in season 1, or at least there were more shots that would last a little bit longer here than they would in season 1. In season 1, they were kind of gone. They would come and they would be gone in a matter of a blink of an eye. Here, I noticed certain shots would linger a little bit more on those 3D CG landscapes that they would often try to use, and I don't want to say force, but really implement into Spider-Man to make it kind of unique from your other Saturday morning cartoons. And they were a little bit more prevalent here, but that's because they had the higher budget. At least they still didn't come off as forced, so I gotta commend them for that. But even though all that stuff is still the case with the higher budget, they still need confines that they need to stick to, because we're still dealing with a hand-drawn animated show in 1995. So certain things need to be done in order to make sure that that budget doesn't go way over crazy, and that means cutting down the episodes and having that frenetic pacing where things are just constantly moving. And of course, you're still dealing with that audience that's going to be returning from season 1, both in the adults and in the very, very, very young like. So you can't really be, just letting them kind of do the work. You kind of have to explain them from time to time, which leads to some exposition from certain characters, and then of course some overacting from others that maybe didn't exactly get the cue on how to be subtle with voice acting.
Hammerhead, what are you talking about?
He kidnapped Elisa from ESU.
He's taken my daughter. You okay?
Also, quick side note, I know that this was kind of sort of the case in season 1, except I felt like they dealt with it in a much more subtle fashion that it kind of went over my head, and I think if it wasn't for somebody pointing it out, I wouldn't have taken notice. But for some reason, in season 2, the writers and the producers were trying really hard to kind of lean more towards that I don't want to say mid-age, but that tween age, or maybe that young adult demographic of people that love Spider-Man a little too much. But ever so often, you have to have those execs kind of pull them back in rather, to be like, hey, we still got those kids, we still got that ad money to worry about. Because more and more frequently in this second season, I noticed more and more characters pulling out guns only to show that the guns are these laser beams. And it would be a bit more obvious here in season 2, where certain cops, like by the book, ordinary city cops from New York, are pulling out these laser guns, and I'm like, where the fuck is it in the budget for this police department to afford these laser guns? And that's where that juxtaposition would really take me out just a little bit and make me go, oh, that's what it is. It's a censor. It's a censor because the writers actually did want to put in guns, did want people here to punch themselves in the face, but they had to animate them into the. And I know that was the case. And I know that was the case with so many TV shows back in the mid 90s, so many cartoon shows that were done from these producers and these writers that didn't want to play down to their audience. And so I have to give mad respects to the people behind Spider-Man for wanting to do that. It's just that it feels weird seeing some of these cops or seeing some of these ordinary people just randomly pull out like a laser gun, or really super high-tech laser gun. And I understand that's a very weird thing to really criticize about a fucking Spider-Man cartoon show, but it just felt much more obvious here in season 2 than it did in season 1, and that's something that unfortunately that budget could not hide. Then again, maybe the reason for why the budget couldn't hide that is because it was too busy showing off its just desserts, being like, well, we're Spider-Man, we made all this money with season 1, let's blow it on all of these licensed characters that just completely flooded season 2, which honestly is one of my gripes with season 2. Is that it might have, and maybe I'll feel a little bit differently once I jump into 3 and 4 and 5, the 5th seasons, as an adult now in modern times. But back then, I didn't really mind it so much. Now, starting season 2 off with the banger that is the fucking X-Men, I'm like, okay, well, you're not being shy with your money now, are you, Marvel, or Marvel Television, or whatever it was called, Fox Television at the time? And this kind of leads me to what the overall synopsis is of season 2. And the best way I can put it is that pretty much the entire 2/3 or so of season 2, which is comprised of 14 episodes as opposed to the season 1 13, is comprised of an overarching plot called Neogenic Nightmare, if I'm not mistaken. And trust me, when you're finished with this plot, you're going to be so sick of two particular words: neogenic and recombinator.
Neogenics.
Neogenic device?
Neogenics is involved.
Neogenic recombinator.
Neogenic treatments
Out of the recombinator. Neogenic treatments.
recombinator.
The recombinator.
Neogenic research.
Neogenics.
The recombinator.
Neogenic recombinator.
And the storyline is supposed to tell something that I think might have been lifted from the comics. I might be a little wrong on this. I could have sworn I've seen a panel here and there that tell the story about this plot, this comic book plot, and they wove it, no pun intended, into season 2, except that, again, with that form of pacing, it does have that cartoon aesthetic. But the plot is pretty much doing something that can probably only, and I really mean it, only work in the cartoons and in the comics. And that's motherfucking Spider-Man turning into an actual Spider-Man, or a man-spider, per se. And this all stems from the actual bite that he got from that spider that bestowed upon him his powers, except here, he's been in the game for too long that finally something dormant inside him has been awoken, and that is this spider beast that's now taking over his DNA. And pretty much from episode 1 to I think about 10 or 11, I think it's 10, he is trying to deal with this issue of possibly becoming a mutant freak, and this whole storyline attracts the attention, and by the attention I mean the licenses from the other companies or shareholders from X-Men, Blade, and the fucking Punisher are all mixed into season 2, and Spider-Man tangos with virtually all of them. And honestly, now as a grown adult watching the second season, even though I was liking the vibe and the way that Spider-Man, who's still witty, once again played wonderfully by Christopher Daniel Barnes, I loved his charismatic approach to all these characters, jumping into his world and his one-liners and just his back and forth, his banter with all these characters, while at the same time making us feel sympathetic for him because he's trying to find this cure, because he's not Spider-Man 24/7. He's got all these other people to worry about. In fact, without delving too much into the spoilers, even though by now you should know, his mutation takes a turn for the worse. So much so that there's literally no way to really have any kind of one-on-one conversation with the people that he loves most, from Mary Jane to Aunt May. So it's almost like at that point he considers his life, his normal Peter Parker life, to be over. And that's something that's that we can kind of resonate with, that makes us kind of feel bad for him. So you stick along with this ride, even though at that point you might be nauseatingly sick of the words neogenic recombinator.
Neogenic
Neogenic.
recombinator.
recombinator.
The recombinator.
Recombinator.
You still take the punches. You still take the punches watching the storyline because you feel for this character. It's a perfect way, and it's a perfect character, or at least a perfect version of this Spider-Man character to go through with this comic book storyline, because a storyline like this, honestly, no matter how you're able to write it and rewrite it, I just personally don't think it would work best in the movies at all. From the CG effects on the actual man spider creature to the way to try to sell it to an audience that's actually going to pay to go see the movie in live action, it's just not going to be able to click. Maybe even for a video game, I would take it more so, or the second Spider-Man game from Insomniac, I would probably take that more so than I would in a live action aesthetic in the movie theater. So I'm glad that at least this version of Spider-Man from the 90s was bold enough and brave enough to take on this plot. It's just that I felt like it was starting to feel a little crowded, seeing all of these different Marvel property characters jump in, especially the darker ones towards the second half, with not only Blade and the Punisher, who are already feeling out of their element, because you know that these are characters who are supposed to be much more on the violent side. I understand that they've written storylines before with Spider-Man where that involved them and had to go on a particular story arc, or would involve them amongst a plethora of other Marvel characters like Fantastic Four and all this stuff. And don't get me started on Civil War and how much of that interconnection and alternate worlds and timelines and universes have all mixed in. But taking the context of the show and having one episode pop in the Punisher, one pop in Blade, and then a couple where the two of them are literally in the exact same thing and Spider-Man's literally bouncing from one to the next, is started to feel a little much. It was already bad enough that I was trying to keep up with the pacing of this being a 20-minute show with, like I said, constantly moving at a frenetic pace to please the younger kids, the really crazy younger kids that are hopped up on sugar and need to keep up, that are perfectly in normal speed motion for them. For me, it's just a little bit too much character to take in, at least now as an adult. Maybe it might have been a different case for me back then when I was a kid, and it was awesome to see that classic portrayal of X-Men from the X-Men 90s cartoon show, even have the theme popped in ever so often when they would appear on screen. But now as an adult, after having been fed so many different portrayals of Spider-Man that are paced really well, looking back at this, I'm like, well, they had to go for their demographic and they needed to do what needed to be done. Now, I'm about to contradict myself mildly. Yes, I mentioned that this neogenic nightmare storyline was kind of creating a little bit of a crowded atmosphere with all these different Marvel characters popping into Spider-Man's world, that they felt, like I said, a little bit out of their element because they're darker characters, or maybe because they're literally a whole team of superheroes in the X-Men that is just like, well, are we really about to shove them in here? Jesus. However, there was one character created by this story plot, at least within the context of the show. I understand he's been lifted from the comics, but within this show, this is actually the one concoction out of this neogenic nightmare storyline that actually tugged a little bit on my strings a little bit. Something that I couldn't say for young me who was just not ready to learn the sympathetic ways of writing a movable character that sure wasn't the most likable at the beginning, but over time made me feel like, wow, this is a really deep tragedy, especially the way it wraps. And that's for none other than Morbius. Morbius, the vampire, created amongst this whole chaos of neogenics and reinterpreting DNA and getting infested with some kind of mutant creature's blood and being turned into this vile creature that has to feed on plasma because they can't say blood and it sounds fucking ridiculous.
Plasma. Another victim of severe plasma drain.
You crave plasma.
I need more plasma.
To steal plasma to get it.
Even though if you go back and watch it, maybe I'll insert it here, there was one instance where one of the characters, I believe it's like Blade's mentor type character who comes in later on, he actually mentions blood. He actually says blood. He doesn't say plasma. He says like he needs to feed on blood. And I'm like, you missed one.
Blade requires regular injections. It prevents him from needing blood himself.
But Morbius is a character that I kind of hated as a little kid only because I'm just like, oh, it's this Dracula-looking type of guy. He's bringing it down. Let's go back to X-Men. Let's go back to those colorful characters. The guys with the claws. Spider-Man with his red and blue suit. You know, I wanted color. I was a kid. I wanted color. I wanted something poppy and funny and fun and fresh. Now, knowing exactly what he says, where he comes from, what he was trying to do at the very beginning with him trying to become a top scientist and actually being like a normal dude only for tragedy to strike in a very anti-form to Spider-Man, where Spider-Man was bestowed powers, he was bestowed more so of a curse rather than a gift for Peter. And this whole story arc spreads across a couple of episodes, enough for there to be both Punisher and Blade make guest appearances. However, the way it wraps up and how it tangles with Felicia Hardy's backstory and also Peter's and how he's able to juggle everything, this was the one character that I walked away feeling really bad for. Even if he wasn't the most likable guy at the beginning. Like I said, he was a little bit of a jerk at the beginning because he was trying to show up Peter. But the dude, without meaning any more puns, flew a little too close to the sun. And the way the story arc ends for him is, in my opinion, a fate worse than a simple death or incarceration. It's like, oh, I don't know why, but there's something about this final shot with him that kind of got to me a little bit. And now as a young adult, I can honestly say that maybe Morbius can be a truly sympathetic villain for Spider-Man. Not a standalone movie. That kind of summarizes the neogenic plot of season 2. Now, a little bit of that neogenic DNA, God, I'm bad with the puns on this review. A few traces of that plot are kind of planted a little bit in the last 4 episodes of season 2 that are completely done with the whole neogenic nightmare storyline. So you don't really feel like a continuation of that. You do get a couple of more villains from the Rogue Alley like Vulture and whatnot. And honestly, looking at the grand picture of it all, the last 4 episodes of season 2 mildly feel just a little tacked on. Like they almost, if I didn't know any better, I would honestly say that the last 4 episodes feel like they were made, but without any real context behind the voiceovers, that when they finally ironed out the neogenic plot and then they realized that they got greenlit for 14 episodes as opposed to what they probably thought was just going to be 10, they actually were like, well, we got 4 episodes. We do have 4 episodes lying around, but they're not tied into the neogenic thing. I guess we can record some voice lines to tie it in there and maybe draw a couple of extra scenes, but other than that, that's really all that we can really do. The only reason why I say if I didn't know better, because I can't confirm that they were animated in advance and then they tacked them on with some re-recorded dialogue connecting to the whole neogenic nightmares storyline, is because one of the episodes does end with a very intriguing storyline for season 3 that I think is going to have a much more profound effect on Peter and Mary Jane and how they go forward with the relationship. Because even though it was charming and kind of cute to see Peter kind of find true love amongst these different women in his life, from Felicia Hardy to Mary Jane, and a couple of times with like I think there was one other character that he was kind of eyeing in season 1. I can't really remember that much, but here in season 2, I think it's almost like Peter himself and me as an audience member is realizing that maybe he needs to make a legitimate choice. And after everything that's unfolded with Morbius and Felicia and all these different heroes and his metamorphosis or near metamorphosis into this creature, it's time for him to make a bold choice. And it looks like that's really what they're kind of eyeing for season 3. and I'm excited to dive into that. So just like I did with season 1, I'm not exactly going to be giving an overall rating on season 2, except to say that yeah, it kind of reminded me an awful lot of that season 2 type of syndrome, where certain shows in their second season, it's almost like they get a little bit too ambitious for their own good. And maybe that might have happened with Spider-Man the Animated Series. Now, I say more so on the lines of cluttering it with a few too many of those licensed characters, because at the time they could and they had the money, so they had to put them in there and promote the show. But at least I'm glad to see that they still had something to keep the true Spider-Man fans connected to the show, with this overarching plot of Peter turning into this creature and trying to become human in the process, both figuratively and literally, while at the same time giving us the stuff that we already love about Spider-Man. That's his personality, his everyday Joe type of approach to life, and also coupling it with some of the technical things that we were really liking about Spider-Man the Animated Series, with beautiful animation, great design for the characters, interpretations of these characters, both visually and also personality-wise, and just making sure that that fun factor is always truly there and making us want to come back for more, even if it is a Saturday morning cartoon with the aesthetics and the guilty pleasures that come with it. So now, guys, I want to hear from you. If you vaguely remember anything from season 2 of Spider-Man the Animated Series from 1995, please post them in the comments below. Where are you guys' fondest memories of watching that show as a youngster, as a teenager, whatever age you may be right now, your fondest memories of season 2 of Spider-Man that have to do with the Man Spider, with the Insidious 6, which do make their appearance at the beginning of this season, that I thought worked for a couple episodes, but I'm kind of glad that they got out when they did, as well as the inclusions of other Marvel properties like X-Men, Blade, what have you. Did you like it? Did you not like it? Were you kind of indifferent for it? And would you be down to rewatch the show now as an adult or as a older kid or whatever you are? And have you watched it recently? Post all of you guys' insights in the comments below. Make sure you want to like this video if you liked it. Thumbs down if you didn't. Share it for others that want to reminisce about the old 90s Spider-Man show. And I'll catch you guys all on the next one. Take care. And yes, the show still has that very Saturday morning cartoon feel based on its frenetic pacing, the way it just kind of quickly transitions from one shot to the next, and then you also have, that bombastic music and the way the characters also tell their lines.
Shocker! You can't escape me! I'll chase you to the ends of the earth!